Lili by Martin Sanders Whiteley. Chapter 7. Cassie. Mina, Lucy, and I were rendered speechless by the bloodbath we had just witnessed. "God damn," said Cassie, looking down at her blood-soaked pink dress. "That's the only dress I have. You'd think this would have happened sooner, considering my lifestyle." Can you really call it a lifestyle if you're dead? She went on like this for a while, muttering to herself and doing her best to get the bloodstains out of her dress with a grimy-looking rag and a nearby puddle of rainwater, with little success. Eventually, she threw the rag aside and looked back up at us. "Anyway, it really doesn't matter what your names are, since I'm going to have to kill you so you don't turn me into the police." I couldn't tell if the look on her face was mock sadness or genuine disappointment. Mina hastily threw aside her black veil to reveal her corpse-pale face and blood-smeared mouth. "That won't be necessary," she said, making a point of showing her fangs as she spoke. "Thank goodness," Cassie groaned with relief, becoming visibly more relaxed. "You're the first vampires I've met in London so far, except the man who turned me. How did you become vampires?" "Who the hell are you?" Lucy demanded. She was in a bad mood after being knocked down. "I told you, my name's Cassie. I was the flower girl on this street corner before I was turned." I threw back my own veil. "I knew it. I remember talking to you not very long ago." Cassie's eyes lit up, figuratively, not literally, in recognition. "You're the one who paid me and told me to keep the flower," she squealed with excitement. "You were incredibly sweet. Thank you." "You're very welcome," I smiled. "What happened to you?" "That's kind of a long story, but I asked first." "Come with us," said Mina. "We'll explain along the way." "Where are you going?" "We're taking a ship to Styria." "Where's that?" "Austria. Eastern Europe." "Okay. I've never been outside of England before, and you're the first friends I've had in a long time, so I'll come. Let me grab my coffin first." Cassie ran up to an old clothing store with a sign that said "Closed for renovation" on the door, climbing through an open window. "We ought to get her a new dress," said Lucy. "You'd think she'd have more than one dress keeping her coffin in a clothing store and all." "The clothes in here are bloody disgusting," shouted Cassie from somewhere in the back of the store. "Yeah, well, so's your dress now," Lucy shouted back. "Shut up." After buying an identical pink dress for Cassie, despite her protests, we prevented the blood-spattered woman carrying a coffin from making the purchase herself. We continued our walk towards the docks. As we walked, I relayed my story just as I had told it to Mina. Mina and Lucy then told their story, frequently finishing each other's sentences. They were at the opera with Jonathan and Mina's father, Dr. Seward. A count from Transylvania by the name of Dracula came to visit them, telling them that he would be purchasing the nearby Carfax Abbey. That night, Lucy was found dead with 2 mysterious marks in her neck. She had been bitten by Dracula, who released her from her crypt, then proceeded to ignore her. She began sustaining herself on the blood of stray children in the park, becoming known as the infamous Woman in White. Eventually, she was tracked down by Jonathan and Abraham Van Helsing, a doctor and occultist sent in to look after Mina, who had a strange illness that turned out to be vampirism. Lucy had a stake driven through her heart. Mina continued to grow sick due to repeat visits from Dracula, and was eventually taken away to join him in Carfax. But Jonathan and Van Helsing managed to track him down and stake him that very night, rescuing Mina in the process. Following Dracula's death, Jonathan failed to realize that, while Mina had been severed from Dracula's control, she wasn't cured of her vampirism. She died shortly before their wedding. Unsurprisingly, being undead proved extremely lonely. After reading about the conditions of my death in the obituaries, Mina decided to take a chance on me. "What about you?" I asked Cassie, when we finished our stories. "What's your story?" "My story? You wouldn't be interested in my story." She averted her cat-like eyes, now more kitten than panther. "We'd be very interested," Lucy assured her. I nodded my agreement. "Besides," added Mina, "we told you our stories. It's only fair that you tell us yours." Cassie let out a sigh. "Fine." As a little girl, I lived in a little town not far from London with my mum, my dad, and my brother. I always loved plants, especially flowers, and I would always play in the woods near my house. Then we moved to London for school. I hated it, couldn't relate to any of my classmates. I stayed as isolated as possible. I missed the woods. As a teenager, I finally found friends. At first, I was so happy that I could find people I could relate to, talk about things I cared about. I also started studying botany. That was going to be my job. As the years passed, my friends all began dating, spent more time with their dates than me. They seemed to think there was something wrong with me because I didn't have a boyfriend. My parents seemed to think so too. Eventually, I started to believe it myself. When the stress became too much, I made the rashest decision I'd ever made. I ran away from home, started selling flowers. I guess I finally did get to work with plants in a way. Then I met a man who fits the description of your Count Dracula perfectly. You can guess what happened next. After I woke up, I brought the coffin back to that street corner, hid it in the basement of that clothing shop. Essentially went back to what I was doing before, except I occasionally killed somebody out of hunger or self-defense. If Cassie had breath, I would have said she was out of it when she finished her story. You know, I said, you only needed to say how you became a vampire. You didn't need to tell us your entire life story. You pretty much told yours. Fair enough. I felt a laugh escape my mouth. Despite all the horrors I had witnessed, I was beginning to feel more at home with a group of reanimated corpses than I had felt with my own family. We stopped walking. We had reached the ship. Chapter 8. The Persephone. I smiled when I saw the name painted on the side of the ship. The Persephone. Our ship was named after the Queen of the Dead. It was too perfect. We glided up onto the creaking boards of the ship, greeted with a disapproving look from a burly man with a thick brown beard that was beginning to turn gray. However, I would soon discover that he always looked disapproving. "I'm Captain Hillier," said the man in a voice as rough as his appearance. His furrowed brow furrowed further as he looked at the identical funereal garments of Mina, Lucy, and myself, then at Cassie's pink dress. Mina's eyes were intensely focused on the captain's face. 3 women all mourning at the same time, the captain mused skeptically, his voice creaking almost in sync with the ship. "We're all sisters," I explained, pointing to myself, then Mina and Lucy. This much, in a sense, was true. These vampires, over the short period of the night, were already beginning to feel like a family. We're mourning our brother who passed away last night. I thought of Jonathan as he struggled against Mina's kiss of death. "I'm a family friend," said Cassie, who sounded like she was on the way to the happiest funeral ever held. "It was his last wish to be buried in Styria," I continued, hoping the captain would buy it. I didn't think his brow could furrow any further, but it did. "If you're only burying your brother, then why do you have 4 coffins?" The man stopped short, his eyes widening for a moment. Then he shrugged. "Welcome aboard," he grunted dismissively, waving us onto the ship. Our boxes of Whitby soil were carried below deck by a group of unpleasant-smelling crew members. "What the hell was that?" I asked, looking at the others for some kind of explanation. "Just a bit of hypnotism," Mina grinned. A timid girl wearing a light blue dress and a head of blonde hair had been standing at the other end of the ship, glancing at us, then looking away as she saw us looking back. She approached us hesitantly, clasping her gloved hands tightly together and trying to avoid eye contact. "Sorry for your loss," she said in a voice that was sweet but thin and fragile, like glass made of sugar. "Thank you," I said, as warmly as a corpse can manage. I already liked her. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a man smiling and waving at us from a dark corner of the ship. The woman seemed to be deliberately trying not to look back at him. The man walked up to us, extending his hand for me to shake. He wore gray gloves like the woman. "I see you've become acquainted with my wife," he grinned at us from behind a wall of pearly whites. The way he looked at me was unnerving. He wasn't looking at me. His gaze seemed to go past me or through me. "Come on, sweetheart," he said, turning his gaze to the woman. He grabbed her hand, and they began walking away from us towards the cabins. The woman glanced back at us a couple times. When she noticed us looking back at her, she forced a smile, but her whole body was trembling uncontrollably. We rested peacefully through the night, in a sleep that was death, lulled into slumber by the repetition of the waves. Over the following nights on the ship, we became better acquainted with the woman. We learned that her name was Clarissa, and she was being married to the man that had looked at us so strangely. His name was Michael, and although Clarissa told us she was going to Austria on a holiday with Michael, there was something in her eyes trying to tell a different story. Every time Mina, Lucy, Cassie, or myself pressed her to tell us the truth, she immediately became aggressively cheerful in her mannerisms and would dismiss us. Then one night, she finally broke. She came to our crypt-like cabin, lit with candles that made the tears streaming down her face shimmer like stars. "I lied to you," she said in a whisper that was like a scream in its intensity. Something about her was horribly smudged. She seemed like a child's drawing that had been smeared as a cruel joke. She took a deep breath, then began to speak. "This is no holiday trip. I'll have to go back to the beginning of our relationship to explain this. It was nothing out of the ordinary. We fell in love, were married, and wanted to try for children, but we never succeeded. I eventually realized that I could not have children. I tried to tell Michael this, but he refused to accept the facts. Instead, he pushed me harder, showing a desperation for a child I hadn't seen in him before. I tried to reason with him, but I soon realized that reason had left Michael's mind. I tried to escape, to send for help, but he discovered my plans before I could reach anyone. That's why he's taking me to Austria, so I can never call for help ever again." She broke into a retching sob that caused her entire body to convulse. I instinctively ran over to the spot where Clarissa sat on the floor and put my arms around her. "Didn't you ever try to fight him? Stand up to him?" I asked. As if on cue, an axe began hacking through the door of our cabin. Clarissa seemed like she wanted to scream, but was too paralyzed to do so. The axe hacked at the door until Michael's face peered through, his fury twisting his mouth into a grin that contained no happiness. "You don't know my husband," said Clarissa weakly, her eyes fixed on the door as the axe obliterated it. A few more swings of the axe, and Michael stood in the room. I was poised for any move Michael might make, as were the other three vampires. Clarissa simply stood there. Michael didn't seem to notice that we were in the room. He only had eyes for Clarissa. At first I thought he would try to hack Clarissa to pieces, but then he dropped the axe, and I knew he had something far worse on his mind. Without realizing what I was doing, I leapt at Michael. I tripped him, his back making an unpleasant cracking noise as it hit the wooden floor of the cabin. I pinned him to the ground before he could struggle, the heel of my shoe digging into his rib cage. I grabbed the axe from the floor and used it to slowly make a small slit in his neck, and pressed my hand forcefully over his mouth when he tried to scream. He struggled against me, then, realizing his hands were free, tried to push me away, his hands landing on one of my breasts. My vision turned red, and I could feel a pain in my mouth, around my canines. Without hesitation, I used the axe to hack off his arms, pressing my other hand more forcefully over his mouth as his screams became even more agonized. Using only my eyes, I invited the others to come drink. I could see a similar red filling their eyes with bloodlust. My anger had wiped all fear and revulsion from my mind. They must be thirsty, I thought. Still keeping my hand firmly over Michael's mouth, I rammed my teeth into his neck with ferocious abandon. I could feel the warm blood bubbling up against my hand as it rose from his throat in retching gasps, trying to escape his mouth. Mina drank from the stump of his right arm, Lucy from the left. Cassie made a small incision in his chest. Once Michael had been completely drained of blood, I hacked off his head with the axe, preventing his return. Then we all looked up at Clarissa. She stared at us, paralyzed in fear, identical to that her face held when Michael entered the room. She was splattered with the blood that had gushed from Michael's neck when we decapitated him. Realization raced into my mind, and with it returned the horror and revulsion. What should we do? I thought to myself. We can't let her give us away, but I don't want to hurt her. We have to kill her, said a voice in my head that was not my own. I almost gasped. It was Mina's voice. Neither she nor any of the others had ever communicated this way with me before. Why have you never talked to me this way before? There's been no need. We have to kill her. Bite her. It's the only solution. But that was agony, said Lucy's voice. I don't want to put her through what we all had to go through. Besides, what will we do if they try to throw her body overboard? They won't find her body, said Mina's voice. Mina quickly walked over to Michael's remains, threw back the curtains on the window, and tossed the mutilated carcass into the ocean. Clarissa whimpered a little, but still remained motionless. What if we just let her go? Suggested Cassie. No one would believe her anyway. No! I screamed internally, the red returning to my vision for a moment. I could see the others flinch slightly when I screamed. Clarissa has spent a lifetime subjected to horror with no one believing her. Better to make her the one they feared than to force her into paranoia for the rest of her life. I'll do it. I walked over to Clarissa. She was trembling. I looked straight into her eyes, focusing hard. I needed to calm her down. With an immense amount of concentration, I managed to tinge the vampiric red of my irises with blue to create a silky violet hue. I looked deep into her eyes. A vampire can usually look into another vampire's mind effortlessly, but it takes an extreme amount of concentration to look into that of a living human. Controlling a mind is easy. Reading one is not. Eventually, I managed to get through the barriers that the living unconsciously set in their minds. I reached a strange mingling of mental images. Michael. Us. A dog, perhaps a family pet. The moon. I willed that for the moment all of these would be clouded in a gentle fog. Clarissa, mentally pacified for the moment, stared at me with half-vacant eyes. Gently, I bent over and inserted my fangs into her neck. My bite was not passionate, as that of the enigmatic painter had been, nor was it sadistic, as it had been with Michael. It was like a medical procedure, performed with scientific accuracy, with the intent of being as painless as possible. When she awoke from my spell, she seemed dazed, drained, still somewhat afraid of us, but at peace for the moment. The boat landed in the port that same night. We five slipped away into the night, unnoticed.